The morning begins just like any other morning. Light slips through the curtains. Not too bright, not too dim. Cars move steadily outside, a sound so familiar it barely asks for attention. Everything seems to run smoothly, with no sign that this day will be any different. And yet, somewhere inside, the emotional rhythm doesn't quite match the rhythm of the world around it. For Scorpio, changes like this rarely arrive with loud noises. They come softly. A moment of standing in front of the mirror, a little longer than usual. A brief pause while holding a cup of still warm coffee. No clear reason, no clear beginning. Just the quiet realization that everything suddenly feels one step slower. That feeling doesn't carry the name of anxiety. It isn't exactly sadness either. And it's more like walking down a familiar road, each step landing where it always has. But the streetlights along the way feel slightly dimmer, and your shadow stretches a little longer than before. Scorpio tends to notice these shifts early, not because they go looking for them, but because they're used to living with deeper emotional layers inside. In moments like this, Scorpio rarely reacts right away. There's no rush to label the feeling, no urgency to figure out what's going on. Instead, there's observation, noticing the growing quiet within, noticing how words that once came easily no longer want to be spoken, noticing a very thin layer of tiredness, like a light mist, not thick enough to block the view, but just enough to make everything look slightly different. Sometimes that offbeat feeling only reveals itself at night, when the room grows quieter, when the late night lamp isn't bright enough to erase the shadows, but not dark enough to feel lonely either. Scorpio sits there, doing nothing in particular, thinking nothing profound, just staying with themselves a little longer than usual, and realizing something is moving inside, even if only faintly. What's interesting is that these moments don't frighten Scorpio. They feel familiar, in a very personal way, like a small fire in a fireplace, not flaring up, not making noise, but glowing long enough to warm the entire room. This shift doesn't demand immediate fixing. It only asks to be acknowledged. In everyday life, others might not notice anything at all. Scorpio still goes to work, still talks, still gets things done. But inside, a new emotional layer is slowly forming. Where it leads, unclear. Whether action is needed, uncertain. And honestly, that may not matter. Because for Scorpio, sometimes simply recognizing that you're no longer perfectly in sync with the outside world is already a gentle kind of awakening. Not to change everything right away, but to know that deep inside, you're still listening to yourself. And sometimes, just that alone is enough. Enough to not rush yourself out of the feeling that's already here. Enough to sit still for a few more breaths, to let thoughts pass through without needing to hold on to them. Scorpio tends to understand the value of moments like this. Not empty silence, but a silence with depth, where everything is allowed to exist exactly as it is. That feeling doesn't push, it doesn't knock loudly at the door. It simply stays, quietly. Like an old acquaintance sitting in the corner of the room, not saying a word, yet not leaving either. At times, it feels like it might fade once the busy day begins, when voices grow louder, when work pulls you back into motion. But then, in a very small moment, between two conversations or while waiting at a red light, it shows up again, light as a gentle touch. This feeling isn't easy to describe clearly. It's not happiness, and it isn't quite sadness. It's more like the sky just before it rains. The air grows heavy, carrying something that hasn't fallen yet. Scorpio is familiar with states like this, not because they enjoy uncertainty, but because they understand that not everything needs to be named right away. There are evenings when all sounds soften, when the room grows quieter, and the feeling becomes just a little clearer, not in a frightening way, just deeper, like late night light reflecting on the wall, creating uneven patches of brightness and shadow. The eyes still see, but the mind drifts somewhere else, a place that doesn't require logic or explanation. Scorpio doesn't rush to share these states with others, not out of secrecy, but because the feeling is still forming, like a small fire just lit. If the wind comes too early, it could go out. So they let it burn at its own pace, slow, warm, with no need for witnesses. In everyday life, everything continues as usual. Schedules move on, conversations come and go. But inside, an emotional layer quietly remains, not leaving, not overwhelming either. It's like a familiar road suddenly wrapped in a thin layer of fog, not thick enough to block the way, but enough to naturally slow your steps. Perhaps it's this staying that truly matters, not because it signals something grand, but because it invites listening to the smallest movements within, listening to the heartbeat when there's no noise around, listening to how it feels when there's no need to be strong or in control. And Scorpio, in their own quiet way, often accepts that invitation. No promises of what will change, no certainty about where the feeling might lead, just allowing it to stay a little longer, like sitting by a window on a calm afternoon, watching the light move slowly, expecting nothing, yet still feeling full in a way that's very hard to name. That sense of fullness isn't loud. It doesn't take the shape of achievement or a clear answer, and it feels more like standing still inside a familiar space, everything right where it's always been, yet somehow you're seeing it through a different lens, softer, deeper. There's no urge to touch anything, no need to rearrange the room, just the quiet awareness that you're fully present in this moment. Scorpio often lives with emotions layered like this. On the outside, things may look calm, steady, fine. But inside, there's always movement, not sudden waves, just small, rhythmic motions, reaching the shore, then pulling back. That's why silence becomes a familiar choice, not as an escape, but as a way of protecting what's still delicate. Keeping things inside doesn't mean holding them down. It's more like placing an unsent letter into a drawer. Not because you don't want to send it, but because the right moment hasn't arrived yet. Scorpio tends to leave emotions there, close enough to feel them, but far enough not to be swept away, watching the smallest shifts, the subtlest reactions to things that might seem insignificant. In weeks like this, Scorpio listens more than they speak, listening to tone, listening to the pauses between words, listening to what isn't being said. Some conversations end, yet their echo lingers much longer than expected, not because of the content, but because of how they felt. A look, an offhand remark. Sometimes that's enough to touch something deeper. The questions that arise are quiet ones, not sharp, demanding questions, but gentle inquiries. Why did I respond that way? Why did that small detail stay with me? They don't need answers right away, and they simply open space. So emotions can breathe, move slowly, without being forced into shape. There are moments when Scorpio realizes they're holding more than one feeling at once: peace and heaviness, stability, and something unfinished. Instead of choosing one to cling to, they allow them all to exist together, like a room lit by multiple light sources. No need to turn them all on, no need to shut them off, just letting the light overlap in the most natural way. It's in moments like these that Scorpio understands the value of not rushing. Not every feeling needs to be decoded. Not every inner movement needs to be shared. Sometimes, keeping things inside is simply a way of staying closer to yourself, listening more carefully to what's quietly speaking from within. And as that very different week continues to pass, Scorpio still moves through each day as usual. The only difference is this: each step now carries more awareness. As if beneath the silence, there's a current gently guiding the way. No need to name it, just clear enough to sense that something is slowly being rearranged according to a rhythm entirely its own. And then that sense of order begins to reveal itself, not through major changes, but through very small details, almost insignificant ones. A message arrives later than usual, not late enough to feel strange, but late enough to let the heart sink just slightly. Not because of what it says, but because of the space while waiting. That space opens into something unfamiliar, a quiet moment where Scorpio notices they're paying closer attention to how it feels inside as time slows down. Some conversations unfold smoothly, and without conflict, without tension. And yet, when they end, their echo lingers longer than expected. A sentence that seemed ordinary, a passing smile, even the silence between two people. All of it becomes small points of light in memory, not to analyze, just a sense that something has touched a deeper layer. Evening arrives in its familiar way. The late light turns on. The space feels smaller. Sounds from outside soften. Scorpio sits there a little longer than usual, not because of exhaustion, not exactly lost in thought, just feeling no need to rush away from the moment. Warm light spills across the wall, creating uneven patches of brightness and shadow, like emotions quietly layering themselves inside. For others, these signs might pass too quickly to register, but Scorpio has a habit of letting them stay just a bit longer. Not out of attachment, but because they naturally feel meaningful, like scattered puzzle pieces on a table. Not enough to see the whole picture, but enough to suggest that something is slowly taking shape. At times, the shift shows up in daily rhythm, waking up a few minutes later, walking a familiar route instead of driving, small choices, not decisive ones. Yet enough for Scorpio to realize they're listening more closely to body and emotion alike, as if an inner rhythm is quietly adjusting each step. In moments like these, there's no urge to explain anything to anyone, no need to name what's happening. Everything is allowed to exist in an unfinished state, like a quiet room at the end of the day, not perfectly arranged, yet warm enough to stay in. Scorpio seems comfortable living in these in-between spaces, unclear, yet deeply real. Sometimes it's this quiet presence that creates a deeper connection to life itself. Small things begin to stand out, the warmth of a cup of tea in the hands, the windows softly rattling when the wind passes through. That moment of looking outside and realizing the sky has changed color without noticing when it happened. Each detail carries a gentle reminder. You're here, you're living, you're feeling. And within this slow-moving current, Scorpio isn't searching for signs of something about to happen. There's no expectation of a turning point, no need for a clear conclusion, just allowing the pieces to keep arranging themselves in their own time, at their own pace, like a long road in the late afternoon light. No need to know where it leads, only to walk slowly enough to notice each small change along the way. Perhaps these tiny signs are how life whispers to Scorpio, not loudly, not with force, just quietly present, enough for someone attentive to sense that the inner picture is slowly gaining depth in a way that feels gentle, honest, and uniquely its own. That gentleness sometimes arrives with a realization so quiet, it's almost easy to miss, that not every feeling needs to be stepped into right away. Not every door that opens a crack needs to be pushed wide open. There are moments when simply standing still at the threshold is already a complete choice. Scorpio seems familiar with allowing themselves to remain in that waiting space. A place without pressure to decide or to fully understand. Not ready yet doesn't mean moving backward. It's more like leaving your shoes by the door, knowing you'll go out eventually. Yeah, but not needing to leave just yet. Breathing slows, the gaze softens, and a sense of safety comes from not forcing yourself to chase something that hasn't taken shape. For Scorpio, respecting that inner rhythm isn't avoidance. It's a very honest form of listening. There are evenings when the room is lit by just enough light to see clearly. No noise, No expectations from the outside, only your own presence. In that space, Scorpio may notice that not rushing brings a quiet kind of reassurance, like a small fire at night. No need to flare up to prove its strength, just burning steadily to keep the warmth alive. Sometimes, that sense of not being ready comes with a touch of uncertainty. Not uncertainty rooted in fear, but in the feeling of standing between two states. One side feels familiar, the other isn't quite clear yet. Scorpio doesn't rush to choose. They stay in the middle, feeling the subtle tilt of the heart, noticing which way it leans and when it might be enough. In everyday life, this shows up quietly. A meeting postponed, a reply left unsent for a little while longer. Not from a lack of care, but because something inside hasn't fully agreed yet. These pauses create space for emotions to settle on their own, like water becoming still again after being stirred. Scorpio seems to understand that forcing readiness too soon can make feelings rigid, so softness is allowed to exist. Not knowing is allowed. Needing more time is allowed. No judgment, no labels. Just an honest acknowledgement of the present state. There's a very private tenderness in how Scorpio treats themselves in moments like this. Not indulgence, but care. So, like shielding a small flame from strong wind, not to keep it small forever, but to give it a chance to burn at the right time, with the right intensity. And when that moment comes, if it comes, Scorpio will recognize it by feeling, not by logic. Until then, not being ready remains a valid place to stand. It doesn't diminish the value of what's being felt. If anything, it keeps everything intact, not rushed into definition too soon. And in that very human space of waiting, Scorpio continues moving forward, slowly, carrying a quiet trust that there's no need to hurry when everything is still being nourished by its own rhythm. It's during that stretch of time that another realization begins to surface, very quietly. That difference doesn't always need a milestone to be recognized. And that change doesn't require a dramatic event to be real. Sometimes an entire week passes so gently, there's almost nothing notable to tell. And yet, inside, things no longer feel the same. Life continues on its familiar schedule. Mornings begin as they always do. Meetings still take place. From the outside, nothing stands out. But Scorpio can feel it clearly. They're taking everything in differently now, more sensitive to subtle shades. A passing glance carries a longer echo. An ordinary sentence leaves behind a faint vibration. That difference isn't loud. It doesn't push you forward or pull you back. It simply shifts perspective. Like walking a familiar road early in the morning, thin fog still hanging in the air. The scenery hasn't changed, yet the edges feel softer. Distances seem wider, and your pace slows naturally. Not from exhaustion, but from wanting to see more clearly. There are moments when this feeling appears right in the middle of everyday life, pausing in front of a familiar shop, hearing an old song drifting in from somewhere. No specific reason, and yet the heart settles, as if a new emotional layer has just been placed inside, not fully dissolved yet. Scorpio notices they no longer react as quickly. There's no rush to conclude. Things are held a little longer, long enough to truly feel them. What's interesting is that this shift doesn't ask for action. It only asks to be noticed, like a faint side path appearing in the morning mist. You don't step into it right away, but its presence alone changes how the familiar road feels. From that moment on, each step carries an awareness that other possibilities are quietly existing alongside. Scorpio doesn't speak much about these inner movements, not because they lack importance, but because they're still very delicate, like a seed just beginning to break through damp soil. Not strong enough to be seen yet, but already engaged in something deeply alive. Those new emotions are nourished in silence, without needing attention or validation from the outside world. On days like this, the external world keeps its rhythm. People stay busy. Plans are discussed. Time moves forward. Scorpio listens, but doesn't get swept away. There's just enough distance to remain connected and enough space to preserve a private inner world. And slowly, something becomes clearer, not through thought, but through feeling. And that difference doesn't need to be proven by events. It lives in how time is experienced, in staying a little longer with a single moment, in noticing what was once overlooked. Everything remains stable on the surface, yet inside, a deeper layer is quietly opening. Scorpio moves through that week without a big story to tell, but looking back, there's an awareness that it was lived from a different place. Lighter in some areas, deeper in others. And even without a clear marker, there's a very real sense that the road ahead, though unchanged in shape, has begun to carry a different meaning, simply because the way of seeing is no longer the same. And when the way of seeing begins to change, the moment of turning inward arrives just as naturally, without needing to be arranged. It isn't a serious session of self-examination. And it isn't a moment that demands conclusions. It's simply a very quiet stretch of time when layers of noise have settled and attention drifts gently back inside. It might be sitting alone in a familiar room, the light soft enough not to expose every sharp edge. That space doesn't feel lonely. It feels more like a temporary shelter, a place where there's no need to appear strong or especially alert. Scorpio is there, without defenses, without building the usual layers of protection, just allowing themselves to be fully present with whatever is there. The emotions that surface don't follow any clear order. A bit of calm mixed with tiredness. Relief alongside a very thin sense of emptiness. There's no need to separate them, no urge to explain. Scorpio realizes that acknowledging these overlapping states doesn't make them weaker. If anything, it brings a rare sense of honesty, the feeling of being oneself, unedited. In moments like this, there's no longer a question of why or what should be done. There's only a pure noticing. Oh, this is how I'm feeling. No judgment, no added meaning. Like listening to a slow piece of music, not trying to predict the crescendo, just letting each note pass through and touch wherever it needs to touch. Old memories drift in at times, quietly, without interrupting the flow of thought. They come and go, leaving behind something familiar, but no longer heavy. Scorpio notices that when there's no resistance, things once held tightly begin to feel lighter. Not because they've lost their value, but because they're being seen through a different lens. Late night light falls across the floor, forming patches of brightness and shadow. Time seems to slow. No one is rushing. Nothing needs to be achieved. In that stillness, Scorpio senses a very particular kind of safety, the safety of not having to hurry out of oneself. Looking inward in moments like these isn't about fixing anything. It's more like tidying an old room, not to change its structure, just to wipe away the thin layer of dust that time has left behind. Everything remains where it is, only clearer. Emotions once overlooked are gently returned to their rightful places, without judgment, without priority. And when that moment slowly closes, Scorpio doesn't carry away a promise or a new plan, only a very quiet sense of relief. As if, after looking inward, something has been fully accepted. No need to say it aloud, no need to prove anything. Just the knowing that deep inside, they stayed with themselves long enough to feel at ease with what is present now. And then, that week quietly slips by, so lightly that, without paying attention, someone might think nothing special happened at all. Everything on the outside continues in its familiar rhythm. Days follow one another, without any clear marker worth remembering. Yet inside, that feeling is still there. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't grow louder either. It stays, like a very thin warmth, just enough to notice whenever the silence lasts a little too long. That feeling doesn't ask to be explained. It doesn't need to be wrapped into a specific meaning. It's like a door left slightly ajar in the mind, not fully open, but not closed. Light slips through that narrow space, and just enough to suggest there's still another room beyond it, one that doesn't need to be entered yet. Scorpio carries that feeling into the days that follow without needing to name it. It shows up in a slower gaze, in not reacting so quickly to things that once caused unease, in evenings when the lights are turned off earlier, in mornings spent sitting a few extra minutes by the window, not waiting for anything, just staying with oneself a little longer. Perhaps what matters most isn't how different that week was, but the ability to sense that difference even when it's fragile. To realize that inside, there are still quiet movements. No noise, no need for recognition, only the need to be listened to. Sometimes, questions still arise. Where will these vague feelings lead? When will they fade? But there are moments when those questions no longer feel urgent. What matters more is having allowed oneself to pause, to look inward more deeply, and not turn away from what is happening inside. And maybe, as these words settle, someone else is carrying a similar feeling. Very light, hard to name, still lingering somewhere in their days. Is it asking to be understood? Or does it simply want to remain undisturbed a little longer? The story closes here, not with an answer, but with just enough silence, so each person can keep whatever quietly touched them, and so that feeling, if it's still there, can continue to unfold in its own time, at its own pace.